This is a parry. Certain video games allow the player to press a predetermined button right as their character would be hit with an attack, canceling any damage taken and, based on how difficult the parry is in that specific game, granting the player a variety of additional advantages. Since the mechanic's introduction in the late 1990s, parries have seen a massive rise to prominence, to the point where it's almost surprising to see certain genres of games launch without them, namely the ultra-popular hack and slash subgenre of ARPGs. So how did this niche feature from 90s fighting games make its way from competitive focused games to single player experiences most players know it from today? And on top of that, why are people so drawn to the experience it provides? That's a rhetorical question, by the way, I'm going to tell you. To evaluate today's parry implementations, we first need to look at where they came from. The game credited with bringing parries to the table is 1994's Samurai Showdown 2, but there wasn't much buzz around this until Capcom's wildly popular Street Fighter series adopted the mechanic in Street Fighter 3. For context, fighting games such as Street Fighter, Mortal Kombat, and many others function by having players string together long sets of complex button inputs into combos where moves connect into each other. How this all works is worth a video in itself, but what's important to know here is that once you tell your character to start a move, that's it. Once they start that move, they are committed to waiting until the whole attack is finished before they can do another. No additional inputs will do anything until the whole animation has finished. On the flip side, even if an attack is blocked, the attacked player must wait a short period before they can respond. This system fills the role that inertia does in real-life martial arts. You can't throw a punch with the same fist without first pulling your arm back from your last punch. In Street Fighter specifically, if the opponent uses a very resource-intensive move called a super, chip damage, or damage through blocks, can outright end the round if the player hit with it already were missing all but a sliver of their health. Enter the parry. In Street Fighter 3, if you entered a parry command up to 7 frames, or about a tenth of a second, before taking a hit, you do not take any chip damage and can act significantly faster following than if you had blocked the same attack. Now, without experience with fighting games, it can be difficult to see the widespread implications of this, especially considering that reacting fast enough to press a button within a specific tenth of a second is incredibly difficult, and missing the timing is very, very punishing. Luckily for us, Street Fighter 3 became an incredibly popular tournament esport, with countless hours of recorded footage of play by the best players in the world. 2 world-famous players, Justin Wong and Daigo Umehara, sat down to play a match in one of these tournaments on August 1st, 2004. The match was tied 1-1 with Daigo playing Ken and Justin playing Chun-Li. Daigo had been cut down to his last sliver of life. Justin should have easily been able to use his super and win the match, regardless of if Daigo blocked or not due to the chip damage. Instead, Daigo did this. Each time these blue sparks shoot out of the fighters is an individual, perfectly timed button press. Daigo was able to parry all 15 hits of Justin's super in a row, then immediately counter with his own super, winning the round in an unthinkable comeback. Even one mistimed input would result in Justin winning the match, but Daigo knew exactly how the super worked for Justin's chosen character, and countless hours of practice paid off, allowing his 15 perfectly timed inputs to be rewarded in an overwhelming fashion. The crowd's reaction as they realize what is happening is staggering. They know that what they just saw will be lauded for years to come. Daigo ended up losing the tournament in the grand finals, but left the tournament having created one of the most famous esports clips in history, allowed only by one mechanic's inclusion. By allowing for moments like these, where a player could exercise near-perfect game knowledge and execution, the parry has cemented itself as one of the flashiest ways to accomplish mastery of one's chosen game, giving the players the keys to demolish one's opponent, provided you have the skill and knowledge necessary to take advantage of it. Fighting games continue to make use of parries to this day, making slight changes to the system as more games are released. Street Fighter VI released very recently, having its own version of parries. But you may have noticed the clip I originally showed to demonstrate a parry looks pretty different than Street Fighter and its competitors. Although fighting games hold claim to the mechanic's origin, what truly made them the gaming zeitgeist they are today would happen years later in a game studio in Japan, a small studio called... The developer From Software has become a monolith in the gaming industry, with their recent venture Elden Ring selling 20 million copies as of the beginning of this year. They have become synonymous with the ARPG hack-and-slash genre, with many people referring to games in this genre as Souls-likes, referring to Dark Souls, the game that facilitated From's massive popularity. While From Software has a great many games under their belts, Dark Souls, its sequels, and pseudo-sequels are revered as bastions of quality in the gaming industry. Dark Souls itself is the worst ranked of them on Metacritic with an 89 out of 100, and Elden Ring is currently sitting at a whopping 96. While these games are the result of hard work from Software, kind of confusing to say it like that, isn't it? From the studio, we can attribute many of the important decisions to director Hidetaka Miyazaki. Miyazaki started at From Software in 2004, working on their mech combat series Armored Core, first as part of the planning staff, then moving to game director of Armored Core 4 in 2006. Around 2005, the studio began to work with Sony on a medieval combat game for the PS3, a new IP rather than a continuation of the studio's previous medieval series, King's Field. Although the studio had quite a lot of experience working with the setting, development ran into some issues. The game lacked identity and purpose, and confidence in the game's sales once released were low. Lowering the game on the studio's priority list, they assigned one of their newest game directors, Mr. Miyazaki himself, to salvage it as much as possible. There is very little information available about the development process following this, only that Miyazaki made sweeping changes to everything about the project once he became the director, and focused on providing a significant challenge for players to overcome. This game became Demon's Souls, the predecessor to Dark Souls. While this project did release to lukewarm reception, the game eventually became a cult classic and performed, especially in the US, far better than expected. This was not enough for Sony, and they declined to fund a sequel while holding the franchise rights. So with a new publisher, Bandai Namco, From Software went forward to develop Dark Souls as a way to continue the series, seeing the potential Miyazaki had to drive the company forward. And drive he did, with Dark Souls considered by some to be the greatest game of all time. The game and its sequels have inspired a generation of game developers, with many adopting the same design decisions to emulate the games they know and love. Games in the Souls-like genre typically pull inspiration from a number of From Software staple design decisions, such as how checkpoints and healing are handled, as well as level design. Parries are a part of this, included in some way in the vast majority of the Souls-likes I am aware of. Although parries had of course existed before Demon's Souls, even outside of the fighting game genre, none of the action games that included them seemed to leave the cultural impact of the Souls series. The closest example I could find is from Tenchu, Fatal Shadows, with the Fang Guard special move looking quite similar to how the Souls series handles parries. This could have served as a point of inspiration, especially considering that From Software would go on to be responsible for Tenchu's PlayStation Portable port. With Tenchu potentially being a source of inspiration, it's unclear how inspired Miyazaki and his team were by Street Fighter parries, or frankly, if they even were. I'm ready to entertain the possibility that parries are like crabs, and all mechanics just evolve naturally towards becoming a parry. But there simply isn't enough documentation available on the design process that went into these first games to determine the thought process. However, there are enough similarities between those original parries and the ARPG parries made popular by From that it seemed worth addressing. With that said, there are also many differences between ARPG parries and fighting game parries that reflect different genre fundamentals. While you can get into player versus player fights in these games, the primary experience is single player or co-op. This means that most of your enemies are controlled by AI. AI opponents cannot complain about things being unfair or unbalanced towards them, and despite common belief, single-player games are intended to be completed, unlike competitive multiplayer games. The advantages granted to players from a successful parry can be much larger, or on the flip side, parries can be made much easier and even become a requirement for progression in certain titles. In addition, the Souls series is more content with encounters being handled quickly, with certain enemies requiring more time to fight or defeat, like bosses. Where fighting game parries are often more about correctly guessing what your human opponent will do, 1v1 fights against non-player characters in Souls-like games are almost more like reading sheet music. A well-designed boss will telegraph their attacks in unique ways, allowing the player to almost practice a call and response with the enemy. A skilled player will spend their first few attempts at a boss encounter just picking up on what the enemy does before certain attacks, and learning the opponent's full moveset. But is there something special about this mechanic that makes it deserve its own video? Great question, me. We've seen parries show up in fighting games, switch genres, and become an integral part of the hack and slash experience. So the final question is, why? What draws us as players to this specifically, and what is so good about From Software's version of it that it was able to have such a massive rise in popularity? I believe the audio and visual design of the parry action carries a lot of weight in explaining why it is so well liked. You hit one correctly and boom! It adds a layer of satisfaction and weight to the move, and in Dark Souls, it typically stuns your opponent for a short time, breaking the tension of combat and allowing the player to bask in the impact of what they've done. Dark Souls then allows you to follow this up with the free riposte, an extremely high damage attack with equally satisfying sound. This audible good boy treat given to the player for hitting a parry and the mechanic's high skill floor has created a spot in gaming culture for it, where players see hitting parries or making ample use of the mechanic as a source of pride. More importantly to the game as a whole, parries grant the player agency. In Kyle Mitchell and Joshua McCoy's paper, Toward an Agency-Centered Ontology of Game Mechanics, agency is defined as such: having actions available to the player that they desire to take, the action itself performing a desired function, and the existence of meaning associated with the outcome of that action. As described in this paper, we can break this down into three terms to determine the agency in a mechanic: availability, utility, and impact. These three categories balance the mechanic out. If the move is more available, it may have less impact, or a move with lots of utility may be less available. So let's go through each of these and determine how the mechanic does in each of these categories and how the categories balance each other in multiple different games. For this, we will compare the parry system from Sekiro: Shadows Die Twice, a From Software title from 2019, which is my personal favorite parrying implementation, and Dark Souls, which has a very classic but sometimes clunky version of the move to show you how each implementation serves the game's goals. Availability. Barring some rare exceptions, parrying is always available to the player in Sekiro once they finish a short intro, unlike Dark Souls and its sequels where you're required to equip a shield on your character before the mechanic becomes accessible. Sekiro's parry is quick and can be used in succession, though notably it does still require precise timing. Button mashing does not work. Dark Souls takes a different approach. A large part of Dark Souls' gameplay loop is equipping your character with gear that fits your playstyle, and if you aren't interested in strapping a shield on your forearm, you may go through the entire game without parrying a single time. Sekiro nearly forces you to engage with parrying, but in turn makes parrying overall much more available and accessible to perform. If you were to choose the sword and board playstyle in Dark Souls and still expect the smooth parry chains of Sekiro, you would be incorrect. Dark Souls parries have very odd timing, in which pressing the button right as the enemy makes contact will not work. Instead, there is a short delay after the button is pressed before the move completes, so you must predict and commit to parrying the opponent's attack much further in advance compared to Sekiro. For these reasons, Sekiro's parry is much more available, but is clearly intentional to balance Dark Souls' wide variety of playstyle choices. Utility. Utility handles the variety of situations in which the mechanic is applicable, and for Sekiro, a better question is, where isn't it applicable? Damn near everything can be addressed with a few well-timed button presses, and anything it can't deal with is clearly marked with this symbol. Another aspect of utility is varied input, or how changes in the button press affect the mechanic. In Sekiro, holding the parry button instead of tapping allows you to block instead, relaxing the timing requirement but also lowering the benefits you receive by doing so. Dark Souls admittedly falls short here. It can be difficult to tell what can and cannot be parried. General rule of thumb in my experience is, if the enemy is attacking with a weapon, it can probably be parried. Otherwise, who knows? Parrying with a shield is also a separate button from blocking, requiring the player to commit even further to going for a parry, and making it easier to fall flat on your face if you mess up. Impact. You may have noticed that the Sekiro clips I'm showing feature many parries in a row, without much reaction from the opponent. When you land one, it increases this meter here, called the posture bar, stunning the enemy when filled, but your opponent can shrug off parry after parry. In Dark Souls, it takes one. As a result of lower utility and accessibility, this increase in impact makes sense. If it's much harder to get a parry to work, the reward granted to the player should be increased proportionally. Sekiro parries are not bad just because they provide lower impact, and Dark Souls parries are not bad just because of the high cost of entry. Instead, they represent different design philosophies and directions for the game as a whole. Ultimately, both systems serve to grant the player agency and control over their own success, provided they have built up the skill and pattern recognizing ability to make full use of them, granting different rewards based on how difficult the system is to use. People like to see the time they put in to learn something difficult pay off, and parries are an extremely flashy way to show you have mastered a game's challenges. It's fine for Dark Souls to make its parry proportionally harder, as not only does it have higher impact, but the player's not forced to engage with the system at all if they don't want to. I'm particularly partial to the naked man with big stick setup myself, which does not even touch parries. Parries resonate with me personally because they feed directly into the type of power fantasy I prefer from the games I play. I want games to make me feel like a master of my craft, and this specific mechanic delivers. Although it isn't that hard to get a baseline understanding of how to take advantage of the mechanic in most games, parries look much more difficult than they are. The slightly higher barrier to entry does enough for the player's perception of the move that once you can get it working for you with any level of consistency, you feel like a superhero. In ARPGs, progression is usually defined by your character stats, and slowly increasing these stats as you level up. You might be unable to progress past a certain part of the game without first taking time to improve your in-game stats. Dark Souls and the other games in this series allow you to raise your stats in this way, but rely primarily on player skill, with some people going as far to complete the game at level 1, just to prove that they can. Parries take control away from the game's systems and put them directly in the hands of the player, allowing them to see not only their character grow stronger as they progress, but also improvement in the skill of the player themselves, deepening their connection to the game's systems. For that reason, the parry mechanic serves to lift the player's confidence as they watch themselves improve and take control of their own path forward. Thanks for watching.